Hello dear student, myself Professor Ashok Kumar and I am working in Department of Mechanical Engineering at Dr. Subhash Technical Campus. First of all, you are welcome to my video lecture series, and through this video lecture platform I am uploading numbers of video lectures as per the different subjects which covers numbers of topics and subtopics. As a part of that, today we are going to discuss one more important and very much the essential chapter from the subject kinematics and theory of machine, that is gear trains. Actually, this video lecture will cover the remaining portion of the chapter gear trains, so it will be the part 3. Because as you have attended my previous 2 video lecture, I have discovered the basic concept of gear trains, its types, like simple gear train, reverted gear train, compound gear train, and epicyclic gear train. I have also discussed about the velocity ratio calculation, especially for epicyclic gear train. That was covered specially in part 1 on same chapter gear train. After that, during my second video lecture on same chapter as a part 2, I have discussed about specially for the gearbox and its types. In that particular video lecture, I have discussed sliding mesh type of gearbox. Then after we have also discussed about the constant mesh type of gearbox, and of course at the end we have also discussed about epicyclic gearbox. So before moving on the remaining types of gearbox, let's have a little bit revision of all 3 previous types of gearbox that have been already discussed in my previous video lecture. In case of sliding mesh type of gearbox, we have seen that and also discussed that there are numbers of gears which are enclosed in a common body, say housing, and ultimate the requirement of any gearbox, as we know that to achieve the requirement of various requirement of the torque and speed, as what I told earlier, that in any kind of an automobile vehicle or even any machinery which operates on the different condition, like some periodic time it requires high speed, in some periodic time it requires low torque and high speed, of course high torque and low speed, like that. At that time we should to use the gearbox. So if we are talking about that particular sliding mesh type of gearbox, generally the gear shifting is required in order to have the variation of the torque and the speed to meet, and that particularly sliding mesh type of gearbox, we know that there is a gear shifter which slide along the main shaft, and ultimately it can have the possibility of the pairing of driving and driven gear, and ultimately we are getting the required speed as well as torque. So in that particular sliding mesh type of gearbox, which is generally used in case of our common automobile vehicle like two-wheeler and other automobile vehicle. Then we have also discussed about the constant mesh type of gearbox. The prime condition about the difference between the constant mesh type and sliding mesh type of gearbox is that the difference is that in case of the sliding mesh gearbox, at a particular interval or the periodic time, there is one pair of gear are remain constantly meshed. But in case of constant mesh type of gear, all the gears that you are using for the different variation of the speed and torque, all the gears are always remain in meshing condition with its paired gears. So just we required to select that particular pair for the required output speed as well as torque. So in constant mesh gearbox, there is a 2 sliding dog that are being used, and by frequently operation of that particular sliding dogs, either left or right hand side, you are getting first gear to be meshed, second gears to be meshed, or even reverse gear are to be meshed. So here in case of constant mesh gearbox, in place of shifter we are using dogs, and dogs are the responsible, sliding dogs are the responsible to engage and disengage the various gears pair required to be joined for the for the motion to different motion and different kind of torque that we require in order to propel our vehicles. Then third type of the gearbox that we have also discussed, that was epicyclic gearbox. As we know that I have already told that in case of epicyclic gearbox we are using epicyclic gear train specially, and the little bit difference is that as compared to previous two, in epicyclic gearbox the shaft of the one gear, like a planet gear, it rotates relative to the other shaft like a sun gear. So over here there is no fixation of the shaft, driven shaft specially relevant to the driving shaft. It can move about and nearby the peripheral surface of the driving shaft, and there is no any kind of sliding dogs or the gear shifter are to be used in case of epicyclic gear. In place of that there are brake bends, and we can say that there is a clutch plate are being used for that, and if you are pressing clutch plate you are getting higher speed, and if you require to have the low speed and high torque you have to use just brake bends in place of the pressing force. So in that way you are getting the required speed and torque as well as output shaft. Now it's time to have the discuss about the remaining types of gearbox. Look at the screen, number 4, that is synchronous types of gearbox. Basically this type of gearbox, synchronous gearbox, find its application in modern vehicle, and a specific feature of this type of gearbox is that in place of a straight line gear, that means spur gear, a synchronous gearbox uses helical gears. Few reasons behind why helical gears are to be used in place of a spur gear or straight line gear is that if you are using helical gear, there will be of course the point contact between a pair of gears. So ultimately it reduces the noise to be produced while transmitting or shifting the gears. So this is the first and most important reason why spur gear are to be replaced by the helical gears. Secondly, the helical gears, if paired with helical gears, then both pair have the not line contact but the point contact between them. So it reduces the pressure and force on teeth. Ultimately it reduces the stresses level that are being produced on each and every teeth while transmitting motion and power. Now synchronous gearbox is generally very similar to the constant mass gearbox, but there is one difference between the synchronous gearbox and constant mass gearbox, and the difference is that in case of synchronous gearbox it is provided with a synchronous device by which two gears to be engaged are first brought into frictional contact, and once they equalize their speed, then and then they will engage smoothly. So ultimately in that synchronous type of gearbox, engagement and disengagement of course happens by virtue of frictions. So whenever clutch shaft and main shaft both are come together and having the frictional gripness sufficient enough that the power can be purely transmitted from the main shaft to the counter shaft, at that time both are connected smoothly and power is going to be transmitted. So it's look like the working very similar as that of the clutch plate, because in clutch plate we have seen that the pressure plate and clutch plate are being first come into contact. There will be a frictional setup across the common surface of both of it, and when sufficient frictional forces are produced, then and then both of the plates are going to be rotated, and that way there will be an assembly of both of the plates and power is going to be transmitted from driving shaft to driven shaft. So In similar way, over here also in case of synchronous gear too, you can see that there is a clutch plate and clutch gear is mounted over it, whereas on the right hand side on main shaft there is a second speed gear. Below exactly that main shaft and clutch plate there is a counter shaft, and there are numbers of counter gears are mounted, and entire assembly, that means the clutch shaft, main shaft, of course counter shaft along with their gears are mounted in a common assembly, and that will be the known as a housing or a body. So this is what some constructional detail and features of synchronous gear. Now look at the bottom side diagram. You see that there is a shift fork and shift rail. Now you sufficiently know that the fork or the shifter are provided to engage and disengage the various pair of the gears as per the requirement. Look at the diagram. On input shaft there is a gear dog teeth is given. There are pair of gear teeth which are mounted in between the input and output shaft. So ultimately through figure we can easily understand that how the dog can work for the assembly of input and output shaft. Along with that gear dog teeth, there is a blocking ring and there is a synchronizer. Over here, synchronizer, basic function of synchronizer is whenever both of the speed is going to be synchronized, at that time this connection, or we can say that the assembly is being possible. Now exactly below it there is a counter shaft, and on counter shaft there are numbers of gears are to be mounted. Of course, for the reverse direction we should use the reverse idler gear, and it is provided exactly below the counter shaft. So this is what an assembly of the synchronous gearbox. Now from the figure we can also say that 3-speed synchronous gearbox is given to you, and generally the housing, rotating parts with bearings and the shifting mechanism constitute a gearbox. Housing is generally made up of cast iron and bolted to the rear of the clutch housing. Generally, housing acts as a container for the oil in which the gear operates, because we know that oil is required in order to reduce the friction, in order to remove the heat that is being produced whenever you are making the messing with the different gears. So all that purpose we require an oil, and oil is generally enclosed within the housing of the synchronous gearbox. Generally, case cover usually carries the shifting mechanism, and it shields the gearbox against the water and dirt. Of course, a shift fork as well, the shift rail is also contained by we can say that the case cover, and it is totally sealed with the housing of the gearbox. So in that way it will prevent to come up water and some other deposits or the dirt particles come into housing and cause the friction or the damage of teeth of gear. Generally the dog, clutch, synchronizer assembly and bearing generally constitute the rotating parts. That means dogs, clutch as well synchronizer having the those parts are mounted on the rotating elements like input and output shafts. So this was the very basic about synchronous gearbox. After that there is one more important type of gearbox that we are going to discuss, and that is differential gearbox. Look at the diagram. You have given 3 diagrams. Left hand side there is a simple very textbook diagram, say. Right hand side there is one kind of model that you have given, and exactly below both of that top diagrams you have given the real diagram of differential gearbox. Generally by carefully watching you may see that there are 2 shafts. One is the propeller shaft. Generally this propeller shaft over which there is one bevel gear is mounted, and propeller shaft is directly connected to the engine through we can say that hook joint. So over here our ultimate goal is to transmit the torque as well, the motion, or we can say that the speed of the engine to the wheel or the real axle, and ultimately real wheel of our automobile vehicle. So over here your prime goal is to convert to transmit the motion and power from propeller shaft to rear axle, and for that we are using bevel gear which is mounted on propeller shaft. Now the bevel gear which is mounted on propeller shaft, which is exactly messing with one another gear, bevel gear, that is crown gear, and the crown gear is mounted on rear axle. So this is how an assembly is being made. Now by carefully watching, there is one cage, and in particular that cage, it encloses 4 bevel gear, actually 2 horizontal and 2 vertical gears. So 2 horizontal gears generally known as a planet gear, and 2 vertical gear are called as a sun gear. Now this was just an assembly of a differential gearbox. Generally its function to transmit motion from the engine shaft to the rear driving wheels, and of course it will rotate the rear wheels at a different speed and torque while the automobile is taking a turn. Generally it is necessary because outer wheels of the curve are required to run at faster speed than inner wheels, since the outer wheels are required to cover more distance than the inner wheels in the same time period. Because whenever you are taking a turn, at that time outer wheel have to cover more radius as compared to inner wheel. It clearly means that the speed of the outer wheel or the speed of the gear which connects the outer wheel axle require more speed as compared to the speed that is being required for the inner wheels. So this is the special case whenever you are taking a turn, outer will require more speed as compared to inner speed, and this is fulfilled by using the differential gearbox. So generally this type of gearbox find its application majority in automobile differential, and generally it is known as a planetary gear, where a set of gear trains operate in a coordinate manner. Generally you have given a simplified schematic automobile differential, and the drive shaft connected to the engine drives, and the pinion that is connected to the bevel gear. Now bevel gear is connected to the differential cage which drives the wheels axles, and whenever the cage is connected to the only one of the wheels axle, which connects the other axle only by means of the differential pinion. So differential pinion connecting the differential gearbox does not rotate as long as speed of the 2 wheels on the axle are the same. If one of the wheels slows due to turning, the differential pinion starts rotating to produce at higher speed on the other way. In that way, suppose you are going for the curvature path, or your vehicle is going to be turned on right or left hand side, the inner wheel gets the little bit rotation as compared to the outer wheels, and that way this proportional velocity difference goes to cover the equal distance by the outer and inner wheel. So this is the very specific, we can say that the gearbox specially used in automobile like truck, car or heavy loaded vehicle, where it is required to turn outer wheel more, or the outer wheel required to travel more distance as compared to inner wheel. Basically it is the assembly of the bevel gears. There are numbers of gears are to be mounted on different rotating elements like propeller shaft, of course rear axle. In cage there are 4 gears, 2 is the planet gears and 2 is the sun gear. And actually entire differential gearbox is mounted on the rear wheel hub. If you have seen that the back side of that particular rear axle, you are finding a huge housing, and if you open that particular housing of the rear axle, you are finding this type of mechanism wherein differential gearbox are mounted. So ultimately the basic purpose not only to transmit the motion and torque, that is required in variation in magnitude for the different periodic time, but the prime function of that differential gearbox is to cover up the large distance through outer wheel as compared to inner wheel whenever you are taking either right turn or left turn. Whenever your vehicle is moving in a straightaway position, straightaway path, at that time the distance traveled by both of the wheel, either inner and outer wheel, required to cover they require to cover same displacement. And that particular time, outer wheels which are connected with the rear axle will move in the same direction, but this speed of the outer and inner wheel only change whenever your vehicle is going to take either right or left hand turn. So this is what about the differential gearbox. After that, very specific and something new types of gearbox that we are going to discuss, and that is Humpage gearbox. It is sometimes also known as a epicyclic gear train with bevel gears. Of course, name given epicyclic gear train with bevel gears, because look at the screen, you can easily understand why given name epicyclic gear train with bevel gears, because in Humpage gear type of gearbox, we are using a pair of bevel gear, and ultimately the mechanism for the motion and power transmission that we are using in case of Humpage gearbox is an epicyclic gear train basically. So that's why Humpage gearbox is also known as epicyclic gear train with the bevel gear. If you are looking for the constructional detail of Humpage gearbox, then the bevel gears are used to make a more compact epicyclic system, and they permit a very high speed reduction with few gears. Useful application of this type of epicyclic gear train with the bevel gears or Humpage gearbox find this application generally in today's modern vehicles like automobile. And Humpage speed reduction gear and differential gear of an automobile generally demands currently for the modern technology of vehicles. So look at the screen. Humpage gear in which the driving shaft and driven shaft are coaxial, whereas the gear B is keyed to the driving shaft, whereas the gear F is mounted to the driving shaft. This is the simple we can say that the assembly of the gears with respect with relevant driving and driven shaft. Now the gears D and E generally form a compound gear, and gear B on the driving shaft meshes with bevel gear D. Now bevel gear D is also meshes with the fixed gear C, and gear F on the driven shaft meshes with the bevel gear E. So in that way, in that series, there is a connection being possible between driving shaft to driven shaft. Now compound gear D and E both revolve freely on the arm A, and generally arm A, which is mounted or attached to the spindle. The spindle generally revolves freely about the same axis as the driving and driven shafts. So this is a simple the connection of we can say that the compound gear of D and E, which is mounted on axle. Now originally Humpage speed reduction gear was designed as a substitute for the back gearing of a lathe. Initially, whenever it is founded and invented like Humpage gearbox, the core concept behind the Humpage gearbox introduction is to replace the gear train which is being used in particularly lathe machine, but its application fine to modern automobile, because it's very easy and very efficient to use Humpage gearbox in case of automobile vehicle too. So ultimately in today's scenario we are using Humpage gearbox not only for the various machineries, but it is also used for the automobile vehicle too. Look at the diagram. You have given two diagrams. From the diagram you can easily understand there is a output shaft, and on the output shaft output gear gears are to be mounted. Actually, both of the gears, fixed gear and output gear, both are of bevel gear, and exactly both of the gears are mesh with double planet bevel gear, which is mounted on a planet carrier, and one end of the double planet bevel gear is mounted with the fixed gear, whereas other end of the peripheral surface of the double planet bevel gear is mounted on the bevel gear, which is mounted on input shaft. So now when you are rotating output shaft, of course the double planet bevel gear, which is mounted on planet carrier, of course will get rotated, and due to its meshing with bevel gear mounted on input shaft, input bevel gear that is mounted on input shaft will also rotate. So in that you are getting the power as well as torque and motion from input shaft to the output shaft. This is basic mechanism how the power can be transmitted from input shaft to output shaft. One more thing about the Humpage gearbox is that it is very simple in construction. It occupies less space. It is used, suppose why automobile prefer this type of Humpage gearbox. One prime reason is that Humpage gearbox required very less space as compared to the different gearbox that we have discussed earlier. So due to less compactness and less space requirement, Humpage gearbox finds its application in today's modern automotive vehicle, and of course the machineries like lathe machines and other machinery. Now generally you can see that all the gears, there are numbers of gears are to be used. All the gears are mounted on driving shaft as well as driven shaft as well, planet carrier and so on. All the gears are of bevel gears. So we can say that Humpage gearbox is encloses or use the only one type of gears, and that is the bevel gears. So that was the simple about the Humpage gearbox. Dear student, this is the end of the chapter number 6, and that is the gear trains. So as what I have discussed in this video lecture, we have discussed about basic 3 types of gearbox: differential gearbox, Humpage gearbox, and that are also synchronous gearbox that we have discussed. So ultimately, if you are revising back your memory and think about the types of gearbox, we can see that the different types of gearbox that we have studied can be have the specific application in various places, like automobile, like machinery, especially workshop machinery like lathe machine, like other machinery, wherein we can effectively use any kind of the gearbox that we have discussed. During entire lecture, if you are finding any difficulty, especially for the operating mechanism of any gearbox assembly, or we can say that the content regarding the power and motion requirement of a different gearbox, let me inform. We will have the solution for the same. Thank you very much for your attendance during my video lectures. Thank you very much.